Welcome everyone, it's great to have you here. Now for those of you who are not from the School of Art, from the broader university or from the community, we're very grateful that funding from the ACT government has made possible this much more ambitious program that we've been doing, and this themed one is on art and the environment. So our visitor today actually isn't very well. He's running a temperature and he's got out of his sickbed, he has the flu, but he's very generously agreed to soldier on. It means it's, yes, you might all want to move back. There you are, that's proof that he's not well. It's going to be very informal. He'll mainly be seated here, and Waratah's going to keep a watchful eye if he gets wobbly. It means that there'll probably only be a small amount of time for questions at the end, if any at all, depending on how Tim goes. It's my great privilege to introduce Tim. I knew him first as an art historian. He has a really distinguished career as an art historian based on work that he did at the National Gallery. But he's one of those rare, quite hybridised creatures who not only has art history behind him, law, but environmental law in particular, but also literature. So it means if you look at his publications, you'll see that there are books, very important books on environmental law in Australia, incredibly significant landmark books on art history in Australia. His Images in Opposition has really redefined how we think about 19th century landscape. And his book, The Colonial Earth, won prizes, as it should have, because that caused, I think, another paradigm shift in how we thought about art and the environment in Australia. And most recently, Tim wrote an incredibly engaging, compelling memoir of his own family called Good Living Street. His family came from Vienna, Jewish background, and it's a great read, so I recommend that to you as well. But his actual position is as Director of the Australian Centre for Environmental Law and the Centre for Climate Law and Policy at the ANU. But we've got him here, in fact, for all sorts of things. Interest in art, the interest in environmental law, of course, but he's a great friend of the school. And he's going to talk about coal seam gas in particular. Is that still the story?
Coal mining.
Coal mining. Yeah. So would you join me, please, in giving him the warmest of welcomes? Thank you,
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me properly? Good. Well, thank you all for coming. When Waratah rang me and asked me whether I'd, talk as part of this series, when I thought about it, I thought that the perfect thing to talk about was a story around this painting called Cremorne Pastoral, which Arthur Streeton painted in 1895. I've always thought it's not a particularly interesting looking painting. I think it's a pretty pedestrian. Streeton, his flashiest work had been done in the late 1880s when he was in Melbourne, and then there are some first pictures from Sydney, like the McMahon's Point picture in the art gallery here, or Fires On in the art gallery in Sydney, which are just much flashier much richer than this one. It's a view taken from near Cremorne Point, for those of you who know Sydney Harbour. It's looking across towards Rose Bay. Lloyd Rees, who must have really liked it at some point, actually identified the spot where Streeton painted it from, and in one of his memoir books kind of identified it quite clearly. I wrote about it in The Colonial Earth, and for those of you who've read that book, then I don't know how exciting the talk today will be. I wrote about it a decade ago, and for those of you who don't know it, The Colonial Earth was a book in which I tried to examine the history of environmental concern in Australia from the beginnings of white invasion, so from 1788, and show that there was a really quite rich history of whitefella environmental concern in Australia, and that it stretched across all the things I was interested in. That it stretched from the art historical and the aesthetic to the legal and political, and it was the first time, and really the only time, that I've really written a sort of big book which has kind of tried to bind together many of the different things I've been really interested in. And so for those of you who don't, I've got so many things I could talk about today. For those of you who haven't read the book, there's a classic kind of supposition that colonialism is exploitative. The whole reason that you have imperial adventures and activity is that you want to find quarries which you can exploit, and that's why you have all the different kind of imperial kind of powers out there. And therefore, the last thing that you associate, or most people have traditionally associated with imperialism, is any form of sort of green imperialism. But when I was in Cambridge doing my PhD, which I did from 1982, very early on I met this remarkable guy called Richard Grove, who ended up writing a book called Green Imperialism. And he, in a context in which Americans had largely kind of claimed environmental concern and the establishment of national parks and all that kind of stuff as being something which they had initiated, and then there'd been a bit of a kind of British kind of and European bite back, partly by Keith Thomas in England, saying that there'd been long-standing environmental concern in Europe. Richard wrote this book in which he didn't pay any attention to Australia, in which he argued that, contrary to the usual kind of suppositions about imperial activity, that in the colonial context, particularly when you had islands which were colonised, you would get enlightened colonial officials who would see the destructiveness of imperialism. And because they were dealing with a finite kind of landmass, rather than being able to do what happened in kind of continental context, where you could kind of pillage one environment and then go on and, pillage and kind of destroy another, that in the island context you had enlightened officials who saw the destructiveness of the imperial kind of adventure and began taking measures to protect that environment, and that they were particularly concerned with preserving forests, that they had various ideas about forests attracting rainfall. They were worried, had early ideas about sort of climate change, particularly linked with rainfall, and that they tried to protect forests, to stop the erosion which would follow if you knock down a forest and then all the topsoil got washed away, to preserve water supplies, and for other kinds of often very, well, typically highly pragmatic kind of ends. And so Richard kind of explores that in a whole range of colonial contexts in parts of what we now think of as the West Indies, and in India and in Mauritius and St Helena, various French and British colonial contexts. Didn't think about Australia. He talked to me for years while he was writing what's been a really influential book. And at some point sitting here and being a kind of keen Australianist, as I used to be, before I sort of discovered Vienna, or rediscovered Vienna, I wrote The Colonial Earth. And so there were a whole sequence of these chapters in which I in various ways, charted a history of environmental concern and based each of the chapters around a painting or a wood engraving or a photograph, and moved out from the art historical into the legal and political. And this was one of the chapters. And I wrote it because I'd got interested. The Colonial Earth stopped in 1900. At one point I thought it'd go all through the 20th century. And I got really interested in Streeton in the 20s, in the 1920s, when he'd done a lot of journalism, and also particularly in the 30s, written, or painted, what in part are not always very interesting pictures, but sometimes have incredibly interesting titles. So, he would do a celebratory picture of a big tree or of a forest, not very interesting, and then he'd call it Australian Forests for Paper Pulp, and might then attach sort of more verse or other writing. And so he was campaigning in the 20s and 30s, both in his pictures and in his journalism, about the destruction of Victoria's forests, particularly the mountain ash forests. And within that, there were, I think, 2 articles he wrote. He loved sort of reminiscing about his kind of glorious youth. And there were 2 pieces he wrote in which he wrote about something called Streeton's Shriek. And what he dubbed Streeton's Shriek was a letter he had written in 1895. Probably in either September or October. I haven't got any of the dates in my head. This picture gets exhibited around then. And it was about the fact that coal mining was just about to happen under Sydney Harbour. So, you know, the coal seams which pretty much come to the surface in the Hunter Valley and around Port Kembla in the Illawarra is a kind of continuous seam, and underneath Sydney Harbour, the coal seam is there, but it's down at around, I don't know, 3,000 feet or, 1,000 metres or a bit more than that. And early geologists, colonial geologists, have worked that out. And, we white fellas began clearly exploiting coal in the Hunter and the Illawarra. And then at some point, they began putting test drills down around Sydney. And the attraction was that if they could actually mine the coal in the metropolis, well, then they would have no costs of shipping or minimal kind of costs of shipping. They'd be able to mine it there and the market would be there, and that was hugely attractive. And so what had happened was that in it's a complicated kind of story, but with government help, government had granted the leases, government had provided a diamond drill, which was at that point some kind of U-Butte technology to put down, a test bore 3,000 feet, and they found what appeared to be high-quality coal in the area between Cremorne Point and Bradley's Head, so between the point and what is now Taronga Park Zoo. And Streeton wrote this letter, or he wrote these reminiscences saying that in 1895, which was at a time, it was at a time when he and Tom Roberts and other artists still had their artists' camp at Little Serious Cove, just sort of in that sort of waterway which was sort of in here. And at the same time they had city studios in Pitt Street, that a team of workmen began clearing a site near Bradley's Head as the site of the new coal mine. And Streeton wrote that he wrote this letter to the newspapers, protesting at this vandalism and devastation of the harbour, and that it was his letter, his self-proclaimed Streeton's Shriek, which then triggered a massive protest which led to the mine not proceeding. And so writing The Colonial Earth, this seemed like an extraordinarily attractive story. And I'll talk about it a bit more in a moment. And that set me off, and this is why, even though I've never thought the painting looked very interesting, I ended up writing a chapter about it. And one of the things which is significant, which I may forget, and I therefore should say now, is that even if you don't think it's the most exciting looking painting, or a painting which doesn't look in any kind of way political, and almost certainly, well, I think quite certainly, he will have begun painting this picture when he wasn't thinking about the coal mine. There was this wonderful review in one of the Sydney newspapers at the time, written in the context when it looked as if the coal mine might proceed, and when there's this huge kind of furor about it. And the reading is, this is a painting which will record this part of Sydney and Sydney Harbour before it gets blighted by the coal mine. So a painting which doesn't look at all political actually gets a kind of political take. Now I should say, and I think my dear friend David Hanson wrote about this when he reviewed The Colonial Earth in lovely terms. I mean, the one thing when I wrote the chapter, I could never find the original letter. And I searched really hard, but it's hard searching those newspapers. And it was one of these kind of conundrums that, why would Streeton in the 1920s, when there was no particular cachet attached to, what we might think of as being, sort of proto-environmentalism, there was no reason for him to invent this kind of story about what he'd done in writing this letter, but I couldn't find it, and I actually haven't, now that there are, more of these newspapers have been digitalised and you can go onto Trove or whatever those engines are, they haven't all been digitalised. I haven't gone back to look, and the trouble is, you're dealing with a hugely richer print culture then than there is now. I mean, now, newspaper culture is so impoverished, and then there might have been 10 or 12 dailies, and quite a few of them had writers of real substance. Anyway, so that's how I came to write about it. And at the time, it seemed to me to be, of all the chapters I wrote, in some ways it was the most modern story. It was the one in which artists were involved, as they often, have been very prominently in environmental conflicts over the last 40, whatever kind of years. Has Bob Brown already talked? Yeah, okay, so Bob will have talked about, I don't know what he talked about, but I presume he talked about Dombrovskis or God knows what he talked about. Anyway. He talked about Bob, did he? Okay, well, his photography is pretty good too sometimes. Anyway, it had art in it. It had very powerful aesthetic arguments. There was a very powerful kind of line where there was a kind of cliche by then that Sydney Harbour was our beautiful harbour, and that it was sort of one of the wonders of the world. And so there was a kind of sense of being common property, and there was a real sense of its magnificence. There was a significant, what we would now think of as NIMBYist flavour to the attempt to stop the coal mine. There were good burgers of Mossman, already now it's a very upper middle class kind of suburb. It was already then. They and their councillors were among the people who protested. So there were people who didn't want a coal mine in their backyard, destroying their property and their property values. But there was also a kind of aesthetic critique of the coal mine which went far beyond that, and which came from people who lived in different parts of the city which wouldn't have been blighted, who just valued the harbour as something which was exceptionally beautiful in itself. So there was an art historical dimension, or an artistic dimension, there was an aesthetic dimension to the thing. The conflict twice went into legal or quasi-legal tribunals. There was an institution called the Mining Warden's Court, where the question of the granting of a particular lease was argued, and the mining warden exceptionally decided that because of the public interest in Sydney Harbour, that the mining lease shouldn't be granted. There was another proceeding before what was, I think, called the Land Appeals Court, and they spoke out against the proposed mine in the most extraordinary terms, much more stridently than you can imagine a court or tribunal doing today. There were suggestions that if the government hadn't taken some measures to stop the mine, the government would have fallen. And so if you think about all these kind of, if you think about our kind of environmental politics, if you think of the Fraser government losing office in 1983 partly because it would have proceeded with the Franklin Dam, if you think of the Howard government partly losing office because it hadn't ratified Kyoto and whatever, if you think of the Court Junior government in WA falling in the late 90s because it wanted to keep on trashing the Karri and Jarrah forests of WA. So that kind of questions about, we have a handful of instances where governments have actually fallen partly at elections because of their environmental stances. And here in the 1890s, we have a suggestion that the then government would have fallen if it hadn't taken action. The action ended up being, and this itself has a kind of real modern feel about it too, is that for various reasons the mine didn't proceed, between Bradley's Head and Cremorne Point, but it got bounced to Balmain, which was then a working men's suburb. It was the middle of the 1890s Depression. There were guys there who were desperate for work. And so, there's this kind of whole, there's a whole geography kind of literature about location of sort of potentially hazardous industries, and coal mines with all their dust, then the way they blacken the landscape, were clearly a noxious, hazardous industry. There's a whole literature about how middle class and upper middle class suburbs are very successful at avoiding those things being located in them, and how these things end up in working class suburbs. And so the outcome in the 1890s was, fits what is a long tradition of that, although it had, again, extraordinarily interesting kind of sides to it, which were that, in a way in which we don't do, they actually had a form of local democracy where at the local polls in 1895, the people who were eligible to vote, which was a kind of narrow franchise, in Balmain voted in favour of the coal mine because they wanted to bring the employment and investment it would bring to their area. So, that long kind of thing. All those things made it seem to me that the dispute which happened around Cremorne Pastoral was really the most modern of all the stories I told in the Colonial Earth. But I guess otherwise I thought the prospect that anyone might actually want to mine for coal or for coal seam gas under Sydney never occurred to me. So while the way in which the conflict was fought out had all kinds of, was just like what might happen today in terms of, litigating all those kind of things and going to Parliament and having protest meetings in the Domain, which they did, and writing letters to the newspaper. I mean, they're all things which we still do. The actual substance of the mine, that could come back, that was the last thing I thought of. And that was the reason I thought it'd be a good thing to talk about today, because there has been just such a dramatic shift in coal mining in the, whatever it is, I think I published the Colonial Earth in 2000. So that's 12 years ago. Coal mining had been contentious off and on in the late 20th century. There were times in the 1980s when big coal mines were proposed in the Hunter Valley, and various sort of winemakers, particularly Rosemont, who I think is still around as a winemaker. There was a big mine called Bangara or something, and they thought it was going to blight their vineyard, and they embarked on huge protracted litigation in the Land Environment Court and the Court of Appeal. I think there were 5 reported cases. Episodically, coal has been a big and controversial issue, but nothing like what it's been since when 2003 or whenever 2004, whenever the kind of current sort of cycle of controversy flared. Now we are in the situation where, in terms of this being a contemporary, still sounding like a contemporary story, in the 1890s, the New South Wales government, as part of trying to promote mineral development, which is what our governments have generally done, had granted this company, the Sydney Coal Colliery or something or other company, mining leases stretching under the whole Sydney basin, so up the Parramatta River and under the whole harbour. And now, I think this is accurate, there's a company called Dart Energy, and they have exploration licences, again, for the entire Sydney Basin. The Labor government in 2008, I have no idea, presumably that was Morris Yemmer, but given the number of changing Labor premiers, I've got no idea which premier it was. But anyway, Labor in 2008 granted these exploration licences for coal seam gas. to this company called Dart Energy. I think the one sort of specific permit they have is to do a drill at St Peters, which is 4 kilometres from the CBD. So when I was writing in 2000, the fact that we could be in a situation 10 or 12 years later where there was that prospect, and if you read the latest quarterly report of Dart Energy on the internet, which I did last night, they say that they have great optimism that they will be able to put down their first sort of tests, 10 of them, I think, this year. That was really unimaginable to me, at least, when I was writing the Colonial Earth. And I mean, clearly, why has that happened? That's happened partly clearly because of demand. We all know about, China and whatever it is, a new power station every week. We know about the arguments that coal seam gas is going to be better for climate change. That's hugely contested, but the argument that the emissions will be less. I mean, the other thing which you may not be as aware of when it comes to the extraordinary expansion of coal mining in both New South Wales and Queensland is that state governments are just extraordinarily dependent on the revenues they get from coal mining, and that they get royalties, and in a context where state government revenue has in general fallen and the federal government has taken control of so many forms of revenue, state governments are hugely dependent on the royalties they get, and it puts them there's a kind of conflict of interest where they are both meant to be the kind of regulator who's looking at the public interest and the environmental interest, and at the same time they have a direct financial benefit from each new mine that they give permission to. And one of the most extraordinary things which the New South Wales government of Neville Wran did in 1981 was that up to about 1981, a large amount of coal in New South Wales was privately owned. A lot of coal had been acquired by private landholders when they got early land titles. Early land titles typically gave mineral rights with the surface rights. And then in 1981, the Wran government enacted a Coal Acquisition Act, which just proclaimed that all coal in New South Wales henceforth was owned by the New South Wales government. Wran justified that on the basis that coal was a public good, and therefore the financial gain which came from mining it should go to the people of New South Wales rather than to the private landholders who happened to have it under the land and happened to own it. It was an extraordinary process because there are not many lawyers in the room as far as I can see, but insofar as we have a constitutional protection which protects us when it comes to government taking our property, that only exists at a Commonwealth level. So our state governments, if they want to, and they've done this a number of times when it comes to minerals, have been in a position where they can acquire, they can take mineral rights from private guys, and they can either do so without providing compensation, which I think they've done a few times, or they can set the compensation at whatever level they wanted. And in New South Wales, there was this extraordinary story. It's hard to imagine a government getting away with it now, where they enacted legislation taking the coal in 1981, and it's only in 1985 that they set up a limited compensation scheme where they paid very small compensation. And I guess at that point also, people just didn't envisage that we would end up having coal mines in the Liverpool Plains or all those places which are, the extraordinary spread of mining which has happened. But that is a real driver as well of what's been happening in relation to coal. Now, I've all been talking about one picture, haven't I? So that's all background And in some ways I've probably told my story, I think. But I'll show you a few pictures, just because that's what one's meant to do. Yeah, so this is just one of, it's one of these stories where in the 1890s, before this furor, there's this general excitement, about the potential of resource development. And so there's quite a lot of imagery out there. This is from an illustrated newspaper showing one of these test bores. After I'd written the book, I realised that the New South Wales government photographer had also done the photography of these bores using the diamond drill, and they actually would have been actually better images, but I didn't put them in the book. And so, there's part of that kind of documentation and in part implicit sort of celebration of, we are hoping to win mineral wealth. This is a cartoon, I think by Hop of the Bulletin. There are a couple of the coal mine in Cremorne was deeply controversial in 1893 and again in 1895. Yeah, so and there was the kind of kin coal language, which has had a big revival, was even bigger back in the 1890s. Yeah, I'm sure you can all read the text. So that, this kind of dispute generates all kinds of imagery. This is another illustrated newspaper engraving. So looking out pretty much from Mossman, I guess. So the Mossman ferry terminal, I guess, is somewhere down here, and the artist's camp is somewhere just around the corner there. And this was some. This was some illustrated newspaper artist presenting how it could look, looking across to the city, showing how Cremorne Point could be entirely. This is when they thought the thing would happen on. They'd actually found the coal between, as I said, between Cremorne Point and Bradley's Head. This was one kind of envisioning of what might happen, and probably done by an artist who was favourably disposed to the coal mine proceeding, because if this had been an antagonistic or oppositional kind of wood engraving, then there would have been huge amounts of black smoke and the whole landscape would have been blighted. Where here you have, I'm sure you've had what had been quite a kind of picturesque, Cremorne Pastoral kind of place. It's been utterly transformed, but the consequences are still highly confined in that engraving. This is just one of a number of photos which exist of the artist's camp at Little Sirius Cove. It shows the kind of idyllic life those guys led. There are also kind of great photos of these guys playing beach cricket. And this is Streeton himself painting, working on one of those little boards he painted, painted on the spot, little oil boards. So it is, if one is thinking about, this is an example of as is so often the case, and we often sort of talk about it pejoratively, using that kind of NIMBY language. This is an example of an artist who gets concerned partly because it is his local landscape. It's a landscape to which he has deep attachment, where he's been camping out, where he's been doing a lot of his best pictures. And I guess the point I just wanted to make was, we often talk very pejoratively about people who are so motivated, and I think that's, in in large part unwarranted. That, why shouldn't people want to protect their, be attached to their local landscape and want to protect it? Partly comes from knowing a place intimately and caring about that that you actually get motivated enough to speak out and write Street and Shriek or whatever you end up doing. And this is now. Where's that picture? I think it's here, isn't it? But it's just one of many examples of how Streeton did lots of pictures which were just, as I said, much more daring and pictorially imaginative. I mean, it's very Japanesey and stuff, but compared to Cremorne Pastoral, he'd been doing a lot of better painting than he managed. It's a typical kind of thing that you have this guy who's doing lots of these small boards, and they're fresher and they're much more imaginative, and then this picture, even though it looks huge on screen, is probably like that. It's typical small dimensions, whereas Cremorne Pastoral, by Streeton's then standards, is big, and he's painting it with totally different intention. He's painting it he's painting these with a view to maybe them being either for fun or to them being acquired by private patrons. And when he gets to Cremorne Pastoral, this is him doing his big laboured kind of statement with a view to public acquisition, which is immediately successful. Cremorne Pastoral gets bought immediately by the Art Gallery of New South Wales. This is W.C. Piggony's, William Charles Piggony's, Flood in the Darling. The flood happened in 1890, and he paints it in 1895. And again, it's in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And I guess one of the things, again, for those of you who haven't read The Colonial Earth, one of the things which I found most extraordinary in going off on that venture was that in 1895, the two pictures of the year in Sydney, this picture here by Piggony and Cremorne Pastoral. And there are two rival art societies, and Piggony is sort of the big landscape painter in one, and Streeton's the big landscape painter in the other. They get acquired within a day or something. They both get acquired immediately by the Art Gallery. They each cost, £150, which is quite a lot. They were both painted with a view to that. The Piggony, painted 5 years after the flood, as a form of history painting, recording what had been the worst flood, I think, in European experience, out on the Darling. But what made it, I wrote another chapter about this picture because I realised that Piggony's brother-in-law was an engineer who was working on damming the Darling, and that the picture was read at the time as being an argument for water conservation. And that was at a time when we now think of, conservation, I guess in the sense of the Australian Conservation Foundation and it being a kind of term in terms of environmental protection, whereas conservation, at least in relation to water, might have been different in relation to fauna conservation, was probably different to water conservation. But water conservation language in the 1890s is very much about how we need to trap the waters from the big wet times and keep them for the dry times. And so we need to build as many big impoundments as we can so that our sheep don't die during the droughts, and do that regardless of the environmental consequences. And this picture was read at the time as being an argument for water conservation, and D.H. Suter wrote about it that way. And so I guess one of the things I found most remarkable writing that book was that here in 1895 you have these two pictures of the year. They're both acquired by the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and they are both given environmental readings, quite different environmental readings. I mean, this is actually a picture which is arguing for a form of resource exploitation, that you should be trapping all that water and then harnessing it for irrigation, or, what we would now do, grow cotton or whatever we would now try and do out there maybe. Whereas the other one is trying to say, let's stop this thing happening at all. But it is a remark, sort of, I don't know, clearly there are years now we have major galleries buying pictures which then end up being on permanent public display, as Cremorne Pastoral and The Flood and the Darling pretty much have been, for the last 100-something years. But you have these two major paintings in 1 year by the two foremost artists being given very different environmental readings. So that there's a whole story about that picture, which is actually a much more beautiful picture. And it's one of these kind of, this is just me blabbing on a bit, but, for so long the conventional art history was that Piggany was a pretty dull, boring, traditional painter, and that Streeton was kind of the embodiment of the modern. But I guess my sense is when you come to, on all kinds of levels, when if your choice is between that one or that one, it's Piggany who wins out pretty well. Anyway, so I think that's what time is it? Okay. Yeah, I think that's about all I wanted to say. So I hope that was half interesting. And let's have questions.